Here is a magenta ink by Sailor, Studio 930.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I classified this under magenta, but it really is a burgundy color. So it falls into this between red and magenta kind of territory, but since it's not red, I decided to put it there. This has a subtle darkening of it as the ink in a predictable way, which I'm really enjoying, and that's as a pen by pen, so we are getting a bit of a tone variation. There is a slight bit of shading in each pen, but not in a really standout kind of way, not something that's going to make you run to it for the shading, but it definitely is there. It is with this ink that I discover the, quote, red inks, or red-leaning magentas, or burgundy, really, is the color that I like for my reds. It makes this a huge winner for me, and one I would love a bottle of.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M120. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're going to get with this, with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading that's going on. Take a look at the "oh yes" on the third line. The O has some darker parts right at the bottom of it, while the top of it is just a tad bit lighter. And the top of the Y of yes is much lighter than the bottom of that Y. The E is a nice mid-tone, and the S lightens up again. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get very nice shading. Taking a look at Goblin in the second line, where the G starts a bit lighter. It gets darker down at the bottom. I thought it was where it crossed the H, but they don't touch. I don't know if you're hearing the vacuum cleaning out. Robot cleaned my house today. That was very interesting to be able to see it. Lost my place. Inside, the inside on the second line, the I starts much darker. It lightens up. Nice mid-tone throughout, but gets very dark at the DE at the end. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get some shading. Look at morning on the first line. Starts as a nice mid-tone, darkens up at the very end of the word. Captured underneath, the C is darker than the A, just a bit. And the P, quite a bit darker. The U lightens up again, and the R gets dark, but the E light, dark again at the D. Again, the shading that's happening is not a huge standout kind of shading. It is very nice that it's there. It's really the tone of this that I'm enjoying the most. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. I would almost want to say that we get no shading, but you do see it. Look at heart on the first line, starts darker, gets lighter in the middle, dark at the T, and it's noticeably darker as a word compared to mountains directly underneath it. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading. Are you seeing it? With R on the first line. Starts lighter, gets much darker at the E, really to the point of the word directly underneath it. The point starts dark, works its way lighter, gets very dark at the T. Even the dot of the point, that point right there, that is darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, flatter as a tone. Here it's being noticeably flatter, and that's something that's been common with this paper, is flatter in tone, but it wasn't really coming across that way with the other two. No feather, no spread, still shades very well. Looking at the on the second line, very dark, but north, right next to it, starts dark on the end, but the top of the end gets lighter, gets dark at the bottom, lighter through the rest of the word, and the TH a bit darker, really giving some nice contrast in some of what's happening there. Looking at the back of the page, we see there is some ghosting in the stub, although with the medium and the extra fine, it's really under control. I think you could write back here, nothing bled through, touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker and a bit more red than it was on the Clairfontaine, an effect of the paper, with no feather, with no spread, with only a couple spots of shading. In still, the first L, a little bit darker on the first line. In hungry, on the third line, the H and the bottom of the Y, a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, darker as a tone than it was on the Clairfontaine, still a bit more of a red than a red leaning magenta. I would think this is red, looking at it on this paper. Again, the effect of the paper, it does these sorts of things quite frequently, with no feathering, with no spread, with very light peppering of shading. I mean, it's there, and you can spot instances of it, like night on the second line, starts lighter, gets darker at the end. Since we're talking about it on the first line, since starts lighter, the I is a bit darker, it lightens up during the N, and then gets dark again at the E. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading. Not a real common thing when it comes to the red, so the fact that it's doing it and it's doing it well here is a bonus for this ink. And when we look at and on the first line, it starts as a mid-tone with the A, lightens up on the N and beginning of the D, much darker at the end of that D. Wobbly, you might say, on the second line, starts lighter, gets much darker, and the L is just a bit lighter than the B and Y that surround it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and we get no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading the same as it does on the Clairfontaine. Most noticeably, you might like it in the word like on the first line, where it starts as a darker midtone. It gets much darker at the K through the rest of the word, where two starts darker and gets lighter. Have on the third line starts dark and works its way light as a word. where luggage starts darker, last word, last line, works its way lighter through the word until the final E. Looking at the medium nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. No feathering and no spread. That would be a surprise if it did it on this paper. It does shade. I don't think the shading is showing as well as the Clairefontaine, but it is definitely there. Thank you on the first line. Starts darker, gets lighter at the AN, and the K is much darker. Where you, as a word, the beginning of the Y is lighter, the bottom part of the Y gets darker, and the rest of the word lightens up, followed by a nice dark exclamation point. Thank you. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than we had with the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. Still would be a surprise if that were to happen. When it comes to shading, we get a fair amount of it. It could be much worse when we look at much worse. That starts lighter, gets darker at the H of must, and worse. The W has a darker midtone at the beginning, much darker tone on the second part of the W, lightens up during the O into the R, S, but the E is much darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Andronope. Here is Noodler's Nightshade. Here is Private Reserve Claret. Here is Robert Oster Opal Mauve. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairefontaine, a little bit flatter, but just as dark, and it's still got a little bit of a something with a magenta to it, not like it's red here. So it's holding on to some color that I like, but it's not, it's farther from what I would want. But it is not bad. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It has shading in the blackberries that starts darker, lightens up during the word berries, but then changes its mind at the first R and changes its mind back at the second R, back to dark at the ES at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than on the Clairefontaine. Now we get no feather and we get no spread. We are getting some shading, and it nibbled away just a little bit on nibbled in the first line. That starts dark or lighter, works its way darker at the B's, lightens up at the L, but then very dark at the ED. Just drink that in the past, like with drank on the second line. That starts darker, lightens up at the AN, and very dark at the K. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with only a light peppering of shading that can be found. Taking a look at found on the first line, you see that the F and the D are a little bit darker than the rest of the word, kind of framing it into place. Put that in the bank with bank on the second line, that the B and the K do the same thing, a little bit darker than the word, than the letters that they surround. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a blue-black ink by Parker Quink Permanent Blue Black. Here is a gray ink by Noodler's Lexington Gray. Here is a yellow ink by Diamine Golden Sands. Here is a black ink by KWZ Warsaw Dreaming. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers, it spreads, it kind of hides some of the best qualities of this ink. I'll normally edit that out. I hope I don't miss it. This is a note to me, hopefully not to miss it. This is bad, and boy, oh boy, yeah, but it shades, so sure, it does that. You see it in Rabbit with the T being a bit darker. I think you're losing some of what is nicest about this ink on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. It is about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Ish, yeah. Feathers, yes. Spreads, yes. Looks good, no. This disgusting mess is brought to you by 20-pound copy paper. Now, it does have some shading. You'll see it in Vanished, as I wish this whole thing would vanish, but everybody wants copy paper. Look at the H as a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering, we get spread, we get a disgusting mess that is this ink on copy paper. I would not use it. If you choose to, you do that with... I will take points off your paper when you turn it in. You do this to me, and you deserve a lower grade for sure. There's no shading, so I guess that's kind of a good thing considering this is 20-pound toilet paper. Looking at the back of the page, without any kind of a surprise, there's tons of ghosting. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, so at least it did that.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine with its lightest tone is just a shade off what I want from my burgundy, and it only has a touch of shading throughout it. The medium was just a shade darker, and what I think I want from my red, and it also brings with it a touch of shading. The stub, while it's largely the same tone as the medium, it was better at having some ink pools and some darker areas. This leads me to want more ink pools, and while I can get it from a wet pen of any nib, I think I still go for a wet stub here.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.